It is no secret that when lawmakers have questioned big tech CEOs in the past, they haven't necessarily have had all the information about how these businesses work. So you wrote up some potential questions for the lawmakers to ask these CEOs, complete with diagrams. Why take this approach?
Well, I think that it's not, I think we all, the majority of the themes around anti-competitive behavior, a lack of oversight, that these organizations have potentially been weaponized to decrease the sanctity of our elections. I think the themes aren't that mysterious. What typically people don't understand is just the scale of these companies. So I thought it would just be, obviously, as you referenced generously, I think a lot about this, have done a lot of work around it and wanted to be helpful, if you will, and just put together on my blog, profgalloway.com, just some thoughts and some of the accompanying charts and infographics just to get a sense or help people get a sense of the proportion and the scale.
Now, you say that you expect Mark Zuckerberg to get the most ire. How are you expecting the hearing, which will be all virtual, to play out?
Well, as is often the case, the war is over before it started. I think big tech has already won. I think that the hearing should have been delayed until they could do it in person. I think it's unlikely. One of the real benefits of a hearing like this, Emily, is there's an opportunity for an unscripted moment that reveals something about the individual or the company itself. I think that's less likely with this type of hearing. Them negotiating that they're going to testify together, there's sort of safety in numbers, and it'll be more difficult to go really deep on any one issue. And the antitrust issues facing Facebook and Amazon are much different than the antitrust issues facing, for example, Apple. So I think the big tech, as they often do with their army of lobbyists, the battle has been won before they show up. I think a Zoom-based testimony is much less forgiving to the witnesses, and also the notion that they're all showing up together. But effectively, you're going to have Zuckerberg will get the majority of the ire, Bezos will get the majority of the praise and the idolatry, and I think Cook and Sundar Pichai are just going to stay out of the way.
Interesting. How would you put these companies in the order from most to least egregious on anti-competitiveness issues?
I think the answer is yes. Look, it depends. I would say probably the most by traditional antitrust. It's probably Google, just because they kind of own the auction house and they're also bidding and selling. In terms of ease of breakup, if Instagram and WhatsApp can be acquired in the last 10 years, you'd think it's probably easy to divest. In terms of economic power and danger to the economy, when you have one company that's adding the value of all of specialty retail, adding the value of the largest company in the world, Walmart, in a 6-week period, you could argue that it's Amazon. In terms of regulation, when 2/3 of our app economy is controlled by the App Store and they're suppressing better products, whether it's Spotify, obviously can't get a leg up, or is an inferior product to Apple Music, or a superior product to Apple Music, but Apple Music is growing faster because they own the rails of the App Store. I think each of them raised their hand when you ask who is abusing their monopoly power. Anyways, in order, I think probably Apple is the least ripe for antitrust because the core asset there is the brand, and elegant antitrust, like a good virus, keeps the host alive. And what you'd want to do is actually unlock shareholder value. So I would argue Apple's probably the distant fourth, but I think the other three, there's a very strong argument to break them up.
Now, I want to dissect some of what you said there. You mentioned spinning out WhatsApp and Instagram. Is that something that you believe should happen?
Yeah, I think at this point, Facebook has very little motivation to comply, to put in place the requisite safeguards. I think that if Instagram and Facebook were separate companies and WhatsApp was a separate company, I think that what you have right now is a platform where 3.5 billion people are on it every month, a population greater than the Southern Hemisphere plus India. And we have one individual who can't be removed from office, who will likely be with us another 5 decades, who get to decide the algorithms which are not transparent to us in terms of what content and which directions they're nudged. And typically throughout power, one of the truisms of business and society is that power corrupts. And so when you have an individual with this much power who hasn't shown a great deal of regard for the Commonwealth, I think that much aggregation of power is very unhealthy. And what you have with these companies is, I believe if you broke them up into three separate companies and 3 to 5 years down the road, I think these companies in aggregate would be worth more than they are now. Your previous guest talked about there's still a lot of value to be unlocked from Facebook. And I think they would have incentives to compete with each other and perhaps put in place the requisite safeguards such that teens don't get depressed or that our elections aren't weaponized. So I think that Facebook is obviously pretty ripe to be broken up. I think shareholders win. Typically in a breakup, every stakeholder wins. Shareholders win, the economy wins, the tax base wins, innovation wins. The only loser is the CEO of the company who finds that they are now just CEO of one of the 7 realms and not the CEO of all of Westeros. And unfortunately, that's the individual that gets to decide this. So I think it's very ripe to be broken up.
So moving on, our Game of Thrones, you mentioned Jeff Bezos. You thought he would be getting most of the praise. He is, the richest person in the world. He has never appeared before Congress, to my knowledge. In recent years, we've seen all 3 of the other CEOs testify on Capitol Hill. How are you expecting Bezos to handle this?
I think he's very good. I think he's very smart. I think he's very charming, and I think he's very likable. I would expect him to laugh a lot. He's got a very likable laugh. I would expect him to talk about how Amazon is hiring more people than probably any company in a 3-month period in history, and use the number 4% or 5%. They're only 4 or 5% of retail. So how could we be any threat to anybody? But more than anything, what he's bringing here is, I think Jeff Bezos has more soft power than any entity in history, with the exception of China right now. When you own the Washington Post and you're testifying in front of a group of people who cling to power like nothing else, and the Washington Post has a lot of influence over whether they get reelected or not, when you have the ultimate man cave in Kalorama and they all want invites to these parties, when you have 100 full-time lobbyists, there are more full-time lobbyists from Amazon right now than there are sitting U.S. senators living in D.C. So Jeff Bezos has tremendous soft power, and I would argue, and he's likable, I would argue that you're going to see just this amount of fire and fawn for Zuckerberg and Bezos respectively. But I would expect that my prediction is that Jeff Bezos is going to put on a master class around delay and obfuscation and go on the offensive. And basically it's going to be a master class in how to avoid regulation and antitrust. And there'll be no shortage of individuals who are willing to give him constant praise and embrace in this sycophanted, gross idolatry of innovators.
And lastly, we have Google and Sundar Pichai. Obviously, Google dominates the digital ad industry along with Facebook. Sometimes it's a little less sexy to talk about, but what are the main challenges that you believe Google presents?
Well, Google is our God. If you talk about the most important process in the history of mankind, it's when our intentions become our actions. And the primary arbiter or source of information that determines how our intentions translate to actions is one firm that gets to decide what content you see when you articulate your intentions 93% of the time. And if you type in how to overthrow my government, you get, is the first return a voter registration form or instructions on how to build a dirty bomb. And one organization controls 93% of those decisions. So I can't think of another industry where as large as this industry, $150 billion, where one company has 93% share. So we have broken up companies and decided it's unhealthy for our economy, unhealthy to have this level of influence globally when companies get to a much lower bar. Sundar is very likable. I think Google benefits from the fact that it's not an easy business to understand. So I would expect that Sundar and Tim will largely just stay away from the train wreck and the praise that is going to be the Zuck and Bezos show here.